The Senate dealt a blow to the White House Thursday, voting to withdraw U.S. aid from the Saudi-led war in Yemen. The president has repeatedly backed the kingdom, despite intelligence linking the crown prince to the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, and pleas from Congress to take action. But lawmakers took matters into their own hands, pulling U.S. military support in a war that's killed thousands of civilians. Senators called it a, quote, turning point in sending a message to Saudi Arabia.
I see this as not an end point, but a beginning point toward a broader discussion that we've got to have, a discussion that refocuses once again on the separation of powers between the three branches of government. Ultimately, this is not a Republican issue or a Democratic one. It's neither liberal nor conservative. It is simply American.
The president has previously threatened to veto that legislation. Excuse me. Zeke Miller is a White House reporter for the Associated Press and a CBSN political contributor. He is there in front of the White House now. Zeke, has the White House responded to this vote?
We haven't really seen any formal response in the form of a formal veto threat statement from the president that they're going to do that. They're going to evaluate this, we're told, see where things stand over the next couple of days. In large part, they want to see where the political winds sail. They have this other shutdown fight brewing. But make no mistake about it, this is a rebuke for the president, a rebuke for this White House, which just a few months ago, before the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, was looking to expand U.S. support for the Saudi-led coalition, arguing that expanding that support would sort of reduce the humanitarian toll there on the ground. Sort of a very controversial standpoint that this administration took in their bid to sort of draw closer ties with Saudi Arabia, and that was dealt a sort of resounding condemnation by the Senate today on a bipartisan basis.
Yeah, so what happens now that the Senate has approved that measure?
Well, yeah, it partly depends on just how far it goes. What does the president do? We've seen from this administration time and again, they argue that the War Powers Resolution does give the president, does not bind the president in this matter. And every president really, since the War Powers Act was put into place, has argued that they will voluntarily comply with it, but that it does not legally apply to them. Under the Constitution because of the broad executive powers. We can see this president sort of force a confrontation potentially over that, or the administration can step back. We don't really have an answer to that just yet, and that's one of the things that we'll be looking for over the next couple of weeks and months to see what the administration does.
Well, let's stick with the Congress for a second. There's a potential government shutdown looming at the end of next week. At this point, does it look like anyone's going to be able to avoid this?
Right now, no. But we're talking about shutdown essentially on the eve of Christmas Eve, coming Friday.
Yeah.
That is the sort of thing that and both sides recognize as not good politics, not good optics. If you look at the rhetoric this week, there's been no movement on either side off of that rhetoric. The president wants his border wall funding. Democrats are unwilling to give it to him. The question, it's a kind of a game of chicken right now. We'll see who blinks first, or we go to a shutdown and then Democrats take over the House come January and pass a government funding bill there that doesn't have that funding. The president believes that this measure is broadly popular for him, but he's going to have that fight over the holiday season, which is a challenging time to deliver any message to the American people. And if the other side of the message is people not getting paychecks, people worrying about their next paycheck, that's the sort of thing that rubs off on the president sort of more than Congress, because just situationally in Washington, because the president is the most visible sort of figure in government. So that's something that certainly White House officials are a little worried about. How do they, if this does go to a shutdown, how do they position the president to come out most likely to succeed, if that's at all possible?
Well, and to the Republicans in Congress, their dismay, the president said, yeah, I'll take the mantle on this. You blame me for the shutdown when it happens. That's not exactly what they were hoping he would say. So on to another topic here. The chief of staff, the president announced Thursday he's down to 5 contenders for that particular job. So in your opinion, who do you think's leading the pack?
It's kind of hard to see. I mean, if you look at the numbers of last week, on Sunday, the number from White House officials was 4. On Tuesday, the president told a few reporters there was 10 or about a dozen. And now we're back down to 5. There's really no indication of why that number would fluctuate so wildly. Today, there was a rumor that Jared Kushner was in the mix, but people close to him say that people have discussed this with the president, but that's not a position he would seek. Sarah Sanders sort of left a little bit of wiggle room there, but did sort of indicate that that was the same place. Names that are still on there: Nick Mulvaney, the director of the Office of Management and Budget, is one that's sort of been a little bit out of the headlines throughout this process, but is somebody who's always been on that short list. People in the president's political orbit, like David Bossie, would be a very controversial pick within the White House, but as somebody who's close to the president and will be at the White House Friday for lunch with the president. Newt Gingrich, the former Speaker of the House, is one whose name that keeps bubbling up, and then sort of other odd sort of outside bets that keep bubbling up are Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin maybe moving across the White House complex, taking that job. People close to him have indicated he doesn't want it, but also names like Bill Shine, the communications director, or even Sarah Sanders, the press secretary. That's how wild the speculation around this process has been over the last week or so.
Yeah, he wants somebody he can trust. And is loyal. That's top and foremost in his mind. We do know it is a very challenging job. The person chosen will have to contend with the ongoing Russia probe. So how might that impact the president's ultimate pick?
It really is a perilous time for anyone to take that job, and because you're walking into an environment where Democrats are about to take control of the House and gain subpoena power, already promising to launch a whole range of investigations into this administration. There's the Mueller probe sort of reaching its end game potentially, and that being an issue for the chief of staff to manage. That can certainly an issue for the president, which means it's an issue for the chief of staff, because that job is both managing up and managing down. It's one of the hardest jobs in Washington, probably harder than the president if you talk to people who've held that job before. And then also the political environment. The president's looking to position himself well for 2020, handle a divided Congress, and divided Washington for the first time. So there are a lot of elements and skill sets required for that job. Loyalty for the president is certainly first among them, but the ability to manage that complex web of interests, managing the staff, managing the president's expectations, all of that makes it as long as the list is of people who are being floated for the job, it's a very short list of people who are actually qualified for it, and it's not clear that any of the people who are on that list really want it.
I was going to say, the shorter list are the people who want that job. Let's stick with the Mueller investigation for a second. The president tweeted Thursday that he never directed his former attorney, Michael Cohen, to break the law. Is there concern, though, around the White House about how the president should and is defending himself?
Talking to White House officials, they've tried to stay out of this process, leaving this to the president and his outside attorneys. Privately, they sort of acknowledge that the president, the more the president talks about this issue, the more his answers and defenses seem to shift, and that they have not been consistent throughout this entire process, and that is an issue for him. Should this reach some sort of criminal or impeachment endgame, or even in a Mueller report that could come out, that could be critical of the president and his truthfulness before the American people. From a legal standpoint, they seem to think that this doesn't really matter, that because the president is the president, he's insulated from this for now, and that impeachment is such an outside process and a political one, ultimately, that they think they can win it. But they're not sure that the president's sort of Twitter defense is really doing him any favors. It's certainly a political response, but is it a legally sound one? A lot of folks in the White House are sort of scratching their heads on this one.
Zeke, we're hearing the drumbeats of the protesters behind you. That's a common occurrence there at the White House, and it is not an intentional metaphor for the imminent release of the Mueller investigation report. But lastly, the president's former national security advisor, Michael Flynn, is also scheduled to be sentenced this week. So what can we expect from that?
Well, the expectation is he's cooperative, and the sentencing recommendations are essentially just a couple of months. It's highly likely that he potentially gets off without serving any jail time, just sort of probation. And the judge has asked for more documents in that case. We've seen the president sort of suggest that he may have been set up in a perjury trap. What is clear is that he has pleaded guilty to not being truthful with federal investigators, and that is a crime. But because it's a first-time offense, it's likely that he would, and the level of his crime is nowhere near that of Michael Cohen. It's certainly possible, likely that he does escape jail time, and that sort of does set up. It's good for him, but for the president, it's not a great headline either way. Another sentencing for a former aide.
Yeah, and they did cite his cooperation in the investigation as being something that should be considered with his sentencing. Zeke Miller, thanks so much.
Thank you.